now ready to get started. Are you fired up? We are Move the Mindset. Our grassroots organization, Move the Mindset, began nearly 2 years ago with the goal of beginning a community dialogue about the lost cause movement and Lafayette's Jim Crow statute. Whether we've seen eye to eye or rarely agreed at all, our conversations with many Lafayette citizens in living rooms and meeting rooms, at libraries, and in coffee shops, at diners, and on telephone calls have kept us inspired and kept us going. From a core of 8 members 2 years ago to 5 collaborating groups at our rally last year, 1 year ago, we now have a growing membership which include collaborations with 15 social and civic organizations. We've grown from 8 people to 15 organizations, and there's no telling how many members each organization have. Move the Mindset is actively engaging and reaching out to the Lafayette community through our educational programs and citywide conversations with a view towards explaining why this statute exists and why in its present location and why it must be moved. This Jim Crow statute was erected in 1922, 57 years following the end of the Civil War. This statute was erected during a time when Confederate monuments and statues became widespread as states were enacting Jim Crow laws to disenfranchise African Americans and resegregate society. These laws and statutes allowed racial hatred to divide our country. This is a statute intended to elicit glorification of Jim Crow in furtherance of the preservation and perpetuation of the lost cause movement, including white supremacy. As a Jim Crow statute, its purpose is to intimidate black citizens and relegate them to a status of inferiority. This type influence contradicts everything America stands for. Some people often talk about protecting their heritage in relation to keeping the statute in place where it stands now. All the talk of preserving heritage might make for great politics, but in the end, it does nothing to move Lafayette forward. We have to move forward, and the best way to do that is to put the political theater of the past behind us. This statute stands on common ground, owned by all the people of Lafayette. But this statute does not represent the heritage of all the people of Lafayette. We should adorn our public spaces with statues, with images, and with monuments. But they should be the kind that reflect unity of the people of our community, not that which divides us. In all of our efforts to have this statue moved to a contextualized location where its historic significance can be fully understood, we have maintained our core values of integrity, respect, unity, and cooperation. We have requested a meeting with the Daughters of the Confederacy, who originally donated this Jim Crow statue to the city of Lafayette, but our request was denied. A request was also made through an emissary to meet with members of the Mouton family but our request received no response. We informed the parish council of our concerns at a council meeting and extended an invitation for them to attend an educational presentation focusing on the civil rights history of Lafayette so that they might better understand the rationale of our position to move the statue. One council person responded that a scheduling conflict prevented his attendance, and one council person did attend the presentation. But seven members made no acknowledgement whatsoever. To make a change happen, we will need your help. We invite you to join our efforts to eradicate obstacles to healthy community relations in Lafayette. As you know, it is once again time for Festival International. This festival is an event that draws media, artists, tourists, and music lovers to our city in numbers as many as 400,000 people. It has a fiscal impact of producing nearly $1 million in sales tax revenue to our city. It is an event of international interest, an occasion to celebrate the true spirit of our community. With this in mind, we ask, does the city's retaining this offensive statue really reflects who we are as a people today?
No. No.
Do we want a Jim Crow statue to represent our city to the world?
No.
We say no. What do you say?
No.
For the sake of exhibiting the progressive and welcoming nature of our city, we invite you to engage in conversation and action in pursuit of our objective to move this statue to a contextualized location and move the mindset of the Lafayette community.
All right, our next speaker is Reverend Zach Sasser.
Greetings in the name of the Lord. I am so honored to be here, looking around this crowd, knowing those who I know as people of faith and people of differing perspectives who are grounded in love, who are grounded in hope, who are grounded in the expectation that we can do better, we can be better than we have been. I'm the pastor of First Presbyterian Church and also the convener of the Downtown Faith Alliance, which is a group of representatives from different congregations in the downtown area. They come together just to try to find ways to encourage and empower life in this city and wholeness. I need to tell you that something you already know, that this is something that seems like it should be an easy issue, a no-brainer, but it's actually quite difficult. I was even speaking with someone just a minute ago about how in her family it's difficult to talk with her daughters after having been to an event like this. I think everybody agrees that hatred and racism and these things, Jim Crow era, they're all bad. And yet there's disagreement over whether or not this statue actually stands for that, even in our families, even in our faith communities. And so I give thanks for the work that's been done so far to educate and stand before you as someone who is a product of that. I came to the last rally, and you may or may not have seen me. I had my little sign that I was hanging out over to the side, and it said, "I'm just here to pray." And I was thinking, I didn't know what was going to happen because of Charlottesville and all the other things that's going on in the world. And I was like, well, maybe I can just be a presence of peace if there's any conflict. And I didn't realize that I was just really comfortably straddling the sidelines. And then I didn't realize how fearfully I was straddling the sidelines. And so when this came around again, and I was encouraged to come, I thought, you know what? This isn't something you can really be on the sidelines for. It's kind of an obvious choice. I spoke briefly with Carlos, who spoke last year, and he mentioned some concerns related to work and whether or not it would be appropriate for him to speak, and maybe I could. And then I just kind of put my name in the hat and realized that it's what God is calling me to do here and now. Just briefly, I want to say that, when's the guy with the collar ever say that briefly, right? You know you're in trouble when the guy with the collar just briefly. But especially when I'm juggling with this thing. But anyway, just to let you know kind of where I come from and on this issue personally, morally, and as part of a citizen of the kingdom of God, what I understand the kingdom of God to be. I am a product of the South. I am a product of the white controlled South, as I guess in some ways we all are. I grew up in Kennesaw, Georgia, which if you haven't heard of Kennesaw, Georgia, it's that town that has the gun law, that every household has to have a gun.
Oh my God.
It's also the town that has the little museum for the General, which is a little locomotive engine that was part of the Confederate supply chain. And they have a reenactment of the Civil War every year, at least they used to. I don't know if they do or not anymore. And what I learned growing up in that environment is that if a pride of heritage, of Southern heritage, is grounded only in that narrative of the Confederacy, then it is a narrative that divides. Somebody has a sign around here that says this statue divides our city. Amen to that. For me, I actually had to go all the way to Africa to get my world rocked, because I grew up with this little worldview that said, I remember stories published in books that we read as children in elementary school, and the only the people of color who were characters in those stories were people who were poor, a single mom, a guy who was a garbage man, and there was a kid I remember who was learning that pilfering was a bad idea. That's the vocabulary word was stealing in small amounts. There's this lie about who people of color are, and this lie about who I am, that we are all people. Reminds me of a shirt that I saw the other day that said, "Humankind, be both." We are all people regardless of the color of our skin, and we are all in this together. Anyway, as I've gone through life, I mentioned going to Africa. I went to a castle that was a slave castle, and going into the dungeon and feeling the pain that oozed from those walls. And then going upstairs and seeing what was directly on top of that slave dungeon, but a church.
No.
And in the back of the church was where they cooked food, and in the back of that was a grate on the ground where they dumped the scraps into the dungeon.
Wow.
And it made me say, what is the dungeon the church is still on top of today?
Wow.
If we're not willing as people of faith to say that symbols of Jim Crow, symbols of racism and oppression are not appropriate for public spaces. Sure, part of history. I like what was said about moving it to a contextually relevant place so we don't lose the lesson. But not here. Not in this space. Not in a place where children... Not in a place where children see it and they have to ask a question about who that is and what's the narrative. Last story I'll share with you. I was a chaplain at the Bethesda for Boys in Savannah, Georgia, several years back. And I had the opportunity to take a couple of kids out just to get a movie. This was back when we actually had video stores, you know? And they were both African American, and we were driving along, and a stop sign, I looked up, and there was a truck that had a rebel flag on the back of it. And I said, what does that mean to you? Because I know what it means to me. I mean, I grew up with this. It's just a part of the fabric of my life. I didn't say that because they were kids. But anyway, and they looked at me like, they looked at each other like, do we really say it? Do we really say it? And I said, no, really, I want to know. What does that mean to you? And he looked at me, and I will never forget it. He said, it means somebody hates him. And as this all got started, I realized that this is the world my children are growing up in, where there are public symbols that children look at and say, I don't feel loved. I feel less than. And we just can't allow that. I guess as we continue to speak to our friends and our loved ones, maybe some good questions might be, would you want this in front of your child's school? Would you want this in front of your church?
No.
Does this reflect who we are as a people?
No.
I say no.
No.
Because I'm here and because I have the collar and I have the microphone, I'm off for a word of prayer. Gracious, holy, loving God, I give you thanks for the desire that you've placed in every heart here, for creating a space that lets people know that they're loved, for challenging those symbols of hatred in our community. I pray, Lord, that you will help us in our efforts to communicate with one another and with those who are still not understanding the relevance of this historically and the relevance of it here today. Be and abide in all that we do, that you might be glorified even here, even now. Amen.
Amen.
Our next speaker is Prejean of Blue Acadiana.
Thank y'all very much for coming today. My name's Kirk Prejean. I'm the president of Blue Acadiana, and I'm here to tell you that Blue Acadiana supports Move the Mindset and its movement to try to remove this statue from its present location.
Yeah.
I heard our priest talking the other day about, during his homily, about the decline of empathy in America. Empathy, of course, being the ability to understand how someone else feels, perhaps someone very different from you, with a very different background. And I would ask you to do an exercise with me for just a minute and try to imagine how it would feel for you to walk into a public building, a building that's paid for with your taxes, and see there a statue dedicated to someone who fought to enslave your race. Imagine how it would feel to walk into a courthouse somewhere, a place where you're supposed to receive justice, and see flying above that courthouse a flag that represents a cause that sought to enslave your race.
The flag of shame. Lost.
It's time, folks.
Yes.
It's time that we move on. It's time that we put this dark page in our nation's history behind us. It's time that we give up this romanticized version or vision of the South. Because there's nothing romantic about oppression and violence. It's time, folks, that we do the right thing, finally, and move this statue. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Frank Croco of Move the Mindset.
Thank you all for coming today. I just wanted to take a moment of silence just to acknowledge that it's Earth Day. Silence for that. We have a lot of struggles. Thank you. We have a lot of struggles happening, and this one, I think, is one of the more pressing ones in town. Thank you for giving me some time to speak here. I'm the secretary of Move the Mindset, and I wanted to start with a chant just to get the blood flowing a little bit. So, what do we want? Remove the statue. When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Remove the statue!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Remove the statue!
When do we want it?
Now!
campaign to move our Jim Crow Confederate statue began 3 years ago, actually, long before most southern cities were even thinking about moving their statues. Since then, many southern cities have removed their statues. Memphis, Austin, Bradenton, Florida, Dallas, Daytona Beach, Durham, North Carolina, Gainesville, Florida, Lexington, Kentucky, Kansas City, Louisville, Nashville, Orlando, San Antonio, St. Louis, St. Petersburg, and of course, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Shreveport. These are just some of the cities that have beaten us to the moral punchline by removing their statues first. And there are others that are planning to do so. Houston, Atlanta, Pensacola, Jacksonville, Richmond, Birmingham, and Charlottesville.
Wow.
Now, that got settled. Had we moved our statue 3 years ago when we started this campaign, when we went to City Hall, actually in 2016, Lafayette would have been a moral leader.
Yes.
Let that sink in. A moral leader. By moving the mindset here, we could have moved the nation. But sadly, we were blocked. We were blocked by an unjust injunction and a century of prejudice. Other cities took the lead and we fell behind, and now the best we can do is follow. The issue of Jim Crow Confederate statue removals is no longer the controversy it once was 3 years ago. Today, removing these statues is not a moral hazard anymore. It's a moral necessity, a moral imperative. The question for us is not if, but when. Many people ask us why we call it a Jim Crow statue. I'm going to give you a short history lesson here, so bear with me. Jim Crow is the name that is given to the period in the South between Reconstruction and Civil Rights, roughly 1878 to 1954. It was a period characterized by the suppression of black civil rights, by devastating segregation, by violent lynchings, new forms of slavery like sharecropping and prison labor. Virtually all of the Confederate monuments went up during this period, many of them placed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the same group that put up this one. They donated this statue to the city in 1922, right in the middle of Jim Crow. Like all the rest of those statues, it was intended to be a beacon of white supremacy, a clear and present reminder of the racial pecking order. Now, many of you might be familiar with the research of, the groundbreaking research of Dr. Swanson, who's here in this group, but I won't point him out. Thank you. He's done some amazing archival research to dig up the history of racism and civil rights in Lafayette Parish, and dispelled many a myth that many people still believe in about race relations here. Well, one of the things that I learned from him is that in the year after this statue went up, the city illegally passed an ordinance that established red lines for housing, discriminatory red lines, and their effects are still visible today. That's Jim Crow. That was just part of Jim Crow. Okay? That's what this statue was part of. So we call it a Jim Crow statue because that's what it is. A statue to celebrate the racist politics and ideology of Jim Crow, which was really slavery by another name.
That's right.
And it happened, of course, that they used Confederate soldiers as convenient icons for this new system of racial oppression. By not removing its racist Jim Crow Confederate statue, Lafayette has fallen behind its sister cities across the South. But there's another way that Lafayette has fallen behind, and it provides yet another reason for us to catch up. While cities across the South, some of the very cities that have moved their statues, are now experiencing economic prosperity, in just 4 years, Lafayette, did you know Lafayette has lost 1/3 of its GDP? 1/3. The happiest city in America is also the nation's 5th fastest shrinking economy. We've lost 25,000 jobs. Like many cities, we rely on tourism to bring in much needed dollars. Festival International starts in less than a week. It's a magnificent cultural event. Have you heard of it? Oh, yeah. How many of you are going to festival? All right. That's it. Come on, festival. How many of you are going to festival? It's a magnificent cultural event that draws in thousands of tourists from across the world.